Welcome, everybody, to the Rabbit Trails podcast in 2021.
Happy
fantastic year. Happy New Year. It is Epiphany tomorrow, Garrick.
Yeah, we're a big holiday in Spain. We're having kind of a modest parade tonight, but Epiphany is a big deal, so we're excited.
Nice. Epiphany's a little bit bigger than Christmas in Spain, is it not?
It's pretty big. That's when kids get their gifts in Spain, so it's.
So do you make your kids hold out?
No, we do a little bit of Christmas, and then we do something small for Epiphany.
Okay.
So they still get something.
So speaking of segues, which no one was speaking of, our guest today is Stefan Paas, who is a theologian in the Netherlands. And I know that welcome, Stefan, to the Rabbit Trails podcast. The Netherlands celebrates, is it Santa Claus Day?
Yeah, you're culturally savvy.
Yeah, in early December, is it not?
Yeah, the 5th of December.
Yeah. So is that when you give gifts to your children, or do you hold?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah. Also with Christmas, but that's actually a newer development.
Yeah.
Innovation coming from the Anglo-Saxon world.
Mm-hmm.
But, originally, it's Sinterklaas, 5th of December, in the Netherlands and in Belgium. Yeah.
Long ago, in a former life, I lived in Central Asia, and I don't know if it was the Russian influence or whatever, but Central Asian Muslims have a Father Christmas that they celebrate with every year, and Kor Bobo is what they called him.
Asia is Christmas all over the world, also in the Muslim world.
It's still a big deal.
Thing.
So big deal. Well, Stefan, we're excited that you were able to join us today. Listeners of the Rabbit Trails podcast will recognize Stefan's name. We have referenced a lot of your works pretty often, so it's a huge honor to be able to chat with you a little bit more and explore the intersection of life, faith, and missions together with you. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, there's one mine.
So I thought that it would be fun to start out our conversation by doing something that I'm sure is every author's dream come true. Someone, maybe I'm being somewhat sarcastic with this, reading. I don't know if it is or not. I'm not an author. Reading back to you some of your own book. Because I found it incredibly impactful, and then as our launching point into where we'll talk today. It comes out of your book, Pilgrims and Priests, and it's in the very first part of it, describing your own journey as a church planter in Amsterdam. And as I read it as a missionary in Sweden, I could have taken out all the words where you were referencing geography and implanted my geography with it, and it would still make sense because it parallels a lot of my own journey. So here's what it says. Despite yourself, you begin to realize how completely self-evident it is for the vast majority in Amsterdam to live without God or the church. In this profoundly secularized environment, people do not even bother to be atheists. God is not interesting enough for one to have an opinion about him. Scholars of religion call this attitude apatheism. Specifically for someone with a missionary heart, this is a nagging realization. It undermines deep assumptions that you hardly ever thought about. People who are inspired by mission often think as entrepreneurs, at least in my experience. They believe that there is a real need for God and Jesus out there, but that the church does not respond to this need because of its closedness. They assert that we now live in a post-Christendom world and that people are therefore finally free to choose their own religion, providing wonderful opportunities for missionary pioneers to play the market. The church could do better, and more people would come to the faith if only the church weren't so afraid to renew itself. Too often, the church leans back in fear or arrogance. People can come to us as long as they adapt to our routines. As a matter of fact, I do believe that many churches could do better, but I also know that this is not the whole problem. Such revivalistic assumptions make sense in a culture of nominal Christianity or in religious parts of the world. But deep secularization means that mission work is not just a matter of a renewed or refreshed supply. You also face a decreasing demand. Regardless of how inventively or creatively you wrap it, there are many people who simply do not find the product all that interesting. My impression is that mission-minded people often do not really dwell on this, but in Amsterdam, this reality will hit you inevitably. We had come to Amsterdam to contribute to mission in that city, to try to plant new churches. And while we did that, I soon noticed that all dreams about mass conversions were based on thin air. While Christianity certainly continues to prove itself as a vital option to some people, sometimes with high-profile conversion stories by leading authors and thinkers, these stories are a far cry from a so-called people movement. Rather than a continuing stream we saw small drops here and there, beautiful drops to be sure. I entered that typical faith crisis that comes with a radical change of life. Only if you become a real minority will you find out how much your faith is intertwined with your social context, how much it depends on plausibility structures that affirm this faith. You ask yourself the question, what it actually means to trust in God, to believe in Jesus and his kingdom, when virtually nobody shares this faith or is even vaguely interested in it. You start to wonder whether it is really worth your time to invest in so much in one seeker who knocks on the front door while so many others leave through the back door. These questions hit you with double strength when you notice that people can be really happy without religion, and that they do not need God either to care deeply about their fellow humans or to give to charity. In most of them, you do not find this sense of emptiness or the vague sense of guilt that can be found among non-believers or ex-churchgoers in more religious areas. In Amsterdam, faith has nothing to do with doing the decent thing or following tradition. If you want to go to religion, you are absolutely free to do as you like, but it is purely a matter of individual appeal, and this appears to happen only to a few. A long introduction to ask a simple question. That sets up the stage a little bit for your journey. Could you give us maybe even context to that or background to that of your journey into being a church planter in Amsterdam, some of that crisis of faith, and even these statements in that?
Yeah. Well, I've been a church planter since the early 1990s. We were invited to plant a church in another area of the country where we lived back then, which was a completely different context, more Bible Belt area. And the group of people we were ministering to were usually, let's say, people who were on the brink of church life or just outside of it due to all sorts of issues, could not be involved in church, psychiatric problems, prison backgrounds, poverty, whatever. So, and then when we moved to Amsterdam in 2005, we were invited by friends to help planting a church there. We met a completely different crowd, a very interesting, challenging crowd. I really love these people. The more, let's say, highly educated young professionals in the metropolitan area. And much deeper secularized, less needy, less dependent, quite happy as long as life goes well. It's a bit different now, so I would say, during the pandemic, and many people have lost their jobs and so on. But back then, certainly. So yeah, well, like in the passage you just read, I think it makes clear that embarking on such a thing as church planting in a very challenging context also invites you to reflect on your faith, on your theology, on your, let's say, operant models of mission. So one of the, I think, the models or paradigms we worked with, at least I worked with, intuitively, maybe not so much reflectively or theologically, but intuitively, was, let's say, this market paradigm, the idea that if the church does better, we will attract more people. And the fact that the reason that we lost this specific group as a church is because the church did not innovate enough or did not package its supply or its offer in sufficiently attractive terms. So, and this is something, when you find out that secularization is a different thing, it's deeper than that. And it's partly also, I think, you can trace it back partly to Christian intuitions even. Well, that's a very complicated story. Maybe we shouldn't go into that now, but so well, it's also part of who you are. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of books appeared that argued that modern secularization in the West is partly, to a large extent, a fruit of Christian tradition and a fruit of Christian mission. Even if you teach people to, so to speak, take responsibility for their own lives, to stand before God as individuals, to think their way through certain issues of faith and so on, then you also run the risk that that they secularize. That is, well, okay, Christianity has made me so strong and independent that in the end I can do this without God.
Yeah.
So, well, anyway, that's a long story. But coming back to myself and to our own journey, so to speak, what I found is that doing church planting as a theologian, for myself, speaking for myself, is a wonderful environment to reflect on what it means to do mission in different contexts. I mean, also in the book I explained that mission, and speaking about mission, is a tradition, sort of journey of the church through different ages and cultures. And now we've entered a new culture, basically, one that we are not really familiar with. And we're working with a lot of models and ideas and paradigms, assumptions from age gone past that are behind us. Revivalistic assumptions often.
When you say intuitively, you had the idea that if we package it right, I don't know if that's exactly how you phrased it, but if we're doing the right things, we'll see the trajectory will be up and forward.
We'll grow.
We'll grow. Church growth model might be a way to say it. Although church growth model does tend to put a sense of maybe too specifically, I don't know, the sense of the church out of Chicago, which I'm totally just
Willow Creek.
Thank you. Okay. Willow Creek model. And that's not, it's bigger than that. But anyway, so all that being is just growth. That, look, the gospel's effective. If we're sharing the gospel, people respond, therefore we'll see things. But why is that intuitive? Or why was that intuitive for you?
Good question. That's a very difficult question to answer. Maybe partly because I'm a Western Christian, used to a certain level of comfort and used to measure success in terms of numbers, statistics, growth, rather than, say, quality of life or suffering or whatever. For example, what I find is that many Western Christians, including myself, tended to derive their models or best practices of mission from areas in the world where the church is growing, like China or sub-Saharan Africa, rather than, say, Morocco or the Middle East, where the church is suffering and in deep problems. Like an Indonesian pastor once told me, he said, well, you're always talking, you're in the West, about the church being a light to the world. So maybe we are, but it's in Indonesia, it's a tea light. And what he meant was this very small candle that warms up a cup of tea or the pot of the teapot. So it said, yeah, it's a light, but it's a very small one, and in a very big world. So those kinds of experiences or practices that are rooted in much more precarious situations, and where the church has struggled to survive or to witness in conditions that are much more difficult and less growth inducive, so to speak, are much less explored when it comes to mission. So one of the struggles I had was, what does it mean to be church, to do mission in a context like that? Not just for a year or 5 years, but for centuries. And that is something, we're still at the very beginning of that in the West, I would say. And I'm not certain. I mean, the West is a unique area, the post-Christian West. So I'm not saying that we will replicate all these experiences from, let's say, the church in the Middle East, or where Christianity was wiped away in the 8th century, by and large. But there may be similarities, maybe even more than with, let's say, China or sub-Saharan Africa. Who knows? At the very least, this is also part of the world church. We should learn from that. And we should not build our templates or our examples just on mass movements and great success and growing churches, but also think of what does it mean to be successful in a context where the church is struggling, but still witnessing for centuries. It's where it's a small minority and even oppressed sometimes. Anyway, yeah.
Faithfulness in that scenario that you just outlined seems to be the key. Not numbers, but faithfulness.
Yeah, without making it into a new model, so to speak. I'm quite wary of talking about models and blueprints. Mm-hmm. But the point is, I think, to learn to understand our place within the world church as living in a very unique context, the post-Christian West, where we are still trying to find our bearings. I mean, we haven't found a silver bullet yet, if we ever will. But at the very least, to understand ourselves as a one voice in this huge choir of the world church, mm-hmm. Trying to learn a new song.
That, I think it's something, an article you wrote way back, maybe that kind of flipped a penny for me when I was doing some research, was that we've never been in a post-Christendom context as a church yet. It's totally new. And I think that's, for our listeners, something important to hear, because we're all having, as we talk to our other friends out there, our other, coworkers, they're all having this dissonance as they come to Europe, or even work in some parts of the United States and Canada, of this just feels, it's not the things we want to see happen are not happening, and they're not the things that we are maybe told, or things we even believe in that can work don't work.
Yeah.
So in that, in your book, you make some great ideas, or some ideas about shifts we need to make in our missiology and our theology. What do you think are some of the big shifts that we need to start to rethink and reimagine ourselves in this new world that you're getting at here?
Well, yeah, like you said, I write about this quite a lot. So let me just mention two things in the context of this podcast. The first is, I think, a shift from, let's say, revivalism to mission. Mm-hmm. Most, if not all, of our concepts of evangelism and mission are rooted in revivalistic movements of the late 18th century, evangelicalism. And still, I think, most of, at least a lot of our mission evangelism is rooted in the assumption that, let's say, deep inside, people are really religious, but they don't know it yet. So we need to awaken them. That is actually the assumption that also many Africans coming to Europe to do mission carry in their bosom, so to speak. Europe is essentially a Christian continent that should be revived to its Christian roots and so on. But what if it is not? It may have never been a Christian continent, but even if it was back then, it's not anymore. It's post-Christian. That doesn't mean pre-Christian. It doesn't mean pagan in the sense of pre-Christian paganism. I mean, there's a lot of, we still celebrate Sunday. We still have Christian holidays. There are certain laws, certain sentiments, human rights. There's a lot of vestiges of Christianity and Christendom going around there. And if you look at late modern spiritualities, then I'd say there's a lot of Christian residue there. So it's not pagan, but it's not Christian anymore. And what mission is, in opposition to revivalism, is to learn to understand that this is not a continent that can be revived, in a sense. There is not. Mm-hmm. You can only revive something if there is still some life there that needs to be revived. So you need to start all over again to do mission, a very pioneer kind of mission, to find new ways to do this in a very new culture. And what we can learn from the past is that it can take decades, if not centuries, to learn these lessons. Decades, generations of loyal, faithful witness, often with very small fruit, before the gospel breaks through, or at least strikes some root. So that's what we've seen in virtually every continent in the past. So you need a lot of patience, a lot of experiment, a lot of hard work and faithfulness. So that's one shift we need to make from revivalism to mission. And the other might be. Do
you think that shift is even? Do you think it's possible? So much of our, I'm not saying I agree with this, but I get worried sometimes that, not worried, I don't know what the right word is, but we both swim Garrick and I swim in organization and a culture in which is deeply rooted in revivalistic thinking, but also, gosh, the churches that I am a part of within the Swedish context that I am, very revivalist. So much of the literature that comes out is revivalist in its thinking.
Yeah.
How does one begin, not combating, but how does one begin to just remain faithful in that setting when so much of, to be honest, to show up to any meeting with people who want to see Jesus lifted high often means that you feel lonely if you think this way. Does that make sense? Like you feel like a bad Christian in some sense, oftentimes.
Yeah. Yeah. What can I say? Yeah. I suppose you're right. That's difficult. That's what pioneering means. Is always difficult. If everyone did it, it wasn't pioneering.
Yeah.
So someone needs to do the first steps. Take the first steps.
Yeah.
You'll get a lot of flack for that, but that's why I think it's important that you have channels like this one where you can find each other and talk to each other, support each other. But again, what you can learn from the past, and that's why I challenge and encourage all my students to read a lot of mission history. What you can learn from the past, from missionaries going out to, let's say, countries like China or India, with elites who were not steeped in Christianity, who were quite critical of Christianity, and who didn't need Christianity because they were quite happy as they were. Thank you. Then missionaries trying to find their ways in cultures like that. I think you can learn a lot from those people. Creativity. People like Stanley Jones, for example, in India, the way he tried to feel his way around creatively, theologically, being a faithful witness, making friends, is, I think, quite exemplary. I'm not sure whether he scored a lot of church growth, so to speak, but he did very good work there. So you need this. Well, you're a pioneer, so that's what it means. I'm supposed to be the first to do something, rather than the follow-up generation. But you're asking about shifts. So the other shift, maybe even more important, I think where a lot of creativity can come from, is a theological shift or a spiritual shift. And that is the question I also discuss in the book. Can we see God in all this? That's basically a very simple question. Or to frame it differently, how is God involved in the secularization of our cultures? And what I think spiritually on a very deep level is that a lot of Christians, good, willing, evangelical, missionary-minded Christians, deep down, are quite desperate about this. They think that secularization is almost by definition something that happens outside of God, that God cannot have anything to do with because it's against God. How can God ever be in a process that discourages people to go to church, to believe in him, and so on and so forth? So I think deep down, many evangelicals work with a sort of split spirituality, that God is always on the side of growth and of full churches and of enthusiastic believers, and not on the side of, let's say, where you experience despair and the loss and the sadness of seeing so many people leave or being indifferent. But what I think we can learn from, and that's what I try to explore in the book, for example, the narratives and the stories of the exile in the Old Testament, is that God is in processes like these. And so I think theological creativity and missional creativity may start with this question: can I think my way through, brain my way through these questions? God, how are you involved in the secularization of our culture? Did you leave us here? Did you abandon us here? Or are you with us? And are you going through this with us? And that's what you can see in the exile of the people of Israel in the Old Testament. It was God who led them into exile, basically. And the people of Israel had to discover certain things, spiritually, theologically, things about God that they could only discover because they became uprooted and dispersed and in diaspora. For example, that God is greater than the nation, greater than their culture, greater than their institutions, and that God can encounter you in surprising ways through those who are outside the people of God. For example, think of King Cyrus, Chorus, depends on your translation. Think of the court officials that Daniel and his friends meet in Nebuchadnezzar's court. The one, what's his name again? In Daniel chapter 1, the guy who helps them to eat the food they want to eat, they need to eat. I forgot his name. He should be mentioned with honor because he helped the people of God to survive. But he was not. My point is, this guy was not a Jew. He was not a believer. He was a friendly face in a world that was not really friendly to the people of God. So I think the point I'm making here is that through this experience of exile, of feeling abandoned, of not having a lot of success and so on, important lessons can be learned and faith is formed in situations like this. So if you read the book of Isaiah, the second part, what Old Testament scholars usually call the Deutero-Isaiah or second Isaiah, the prophet who prophesied in the exile, so chapters 40 and further, that's where you can see that a prophet who lives in exile, as a small minority, not very successful, discovers great things about God. But he indeed is the God of all the world, of the whole world. And I think, to be honest, if you look back on the high tide of Christendom, which is not so far behind us actually, in the Netherlands, I would say, even in the 1950s, you would have still a very strong Christendom situation. The United States, maybe even now in some areas.
Yeah.
In Sweden, probably somewhat further back. But the point is, in those situations, Christians may be too triumphant, maybe too inclined to connect God almost self-evidently with the kind of arrangements of institutions and power they have established, and without really wanting it. Maybe it's usually an intuitive thing, a thing that's just part of us. We do it unthinkingly, and one of the reasons why post-Christendom or exile is so painful is that you're sort of ripped apart. It's a very painful surgery in a way that all these elements are cut away from you. Yeah.
But that's in large measure what you're getting out there, what it means to really find God and know Him from the minority standpoint. I remember when same-sex marriage was passed in the United States. I remember thinking, well, if the church is ready, welcome to its best days, because we've just found ourselves in the minority position, and if we're willing to accept that this is the case, then we're willing to know God in different ways. And I don't think it's gone so well for the church in America since then, but that's probably for a different podcast.
Well, yeah, just one take on that. I think what you can see, not just in America, but until recently, and maybe still in the Netherlands as well, is this whole culture wars paradigm, which I think is deeply connected with the Christendom mindset. The idea that somehow, somewhere, the Christians need to save culture and need to keep their grip on it, and that will not work, I can tell you.
Yeah.
No, it seems to be some of my most joyous days as a missionary were in places like North Africa and Central Asia, where I never assumed that I needed to save anything.
Exactly.
I just needed to live Jesus.
Yep.
And there was beauty in that. Now I will say it was very difficult. We even had, there were government informants in an underground church, and there was difficult things that happened. So it wasn't easy, but there was a depth of relationship with each other and community with the Lord and creativity, certainly. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's one of the experiences I had in Amsterdam, as I explained in the book. It's not always easy, but I think somewhere in the book I write, I don't want to raise the impression that it is all despair, or that it is all sort of misery to live in a post-Christian culture. On the contrary, it's also very relaxing. It takes away a lot of, let's say, secondary issues that are part of a culture war. There are no Christian schools, there are no Christian politics, all these issues that Christians are concerned about in the more Christian parts of the country. or in the Christian parts of the world. There's nothing to keep, nothing to control. It's out of your control. Others are calling the shots, not Christians. So you can concentrate on very basic witness. Yeah.
We've seen something very interesting, and you mentioned it in your book as well, about the ability for now there's a greater unity as everyone kind of gets pushed into this little camp.
In my case,
yeah, you start seeing that, we've seen that in Spain, where the Catholic Church, where maybe 20 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago, for Protestants and Catholics to come together and serve together or do something together would have been, I mean, people would get killed for that. But now that we have Catholic organizations and priests coming to us and, hey, can you help us with this, and vice versa, and there's this openness that has never existed. I think that's a very interesting thing also about the situation we're in, this ability to really identify who is really behind mission for the cause of Christ.
Yeah, that's a wonderful remark. Thank you for that. Yeah, so one of the things you can see, I'm not let's say a Christendom critic per se. I mean, what's good in it as well. I don't think it makes much sense to just write off 1,000 to 1,500 years of history. That's stupid. But one of the almost demonic dimensions of Christendom was this horrible splits in the body of Christ.
Yeah.
We have become much too used to that. It's become a routine in Christian life and in ecclesial life. And if one of the effects of post-Christendom is that Christians from different denominations and churches find each other again and are rebuilding the body of Christ, so to speak, or reformed into the body of Christ, that would be great. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's interesting what happens when the process of exile, as you've mentioned, when you're torn from your institutions, would you say that, or when you're torn from your culture, does it have a revealing effect on what our idols are, what we're really worshiping?
Maybe. I think in general, it's easier to see idols when you don't have them anymore. The idols of the past are always easier to discern than the idols that you have now. Yeah. So I would be careful. I mean, this shouldn't become a sort of self-congratulating story. We have left behind Christendom and see us. We really know how it works, Christianity. I think we're probably in different idolatries that are hopefully our grandchildren will be able to discern. But to an extent it's true, I think. I mean, the whole addiction to power and the idea that mission sort of implicates the power to control society, or that mission models are almost always predicated on ideas of a sort of Christianized social order as a sort of end result of mission. We find it very, very difficult to think about mission without having in view a sort of transformed society, so to speak. Even when I read through the work, for example, of a scholar that I really respect, like Tom Wright, for example, but there are others as well, who talk about the transformation ideals, they always leave a bit into vagueness what they mean with a transformed society. And I think that's very wise, because immediately Christendom bells start to ring. We had a Christianized social order once, and see what it brought us. That's a very mixed blessing. And it always raises the issue of power, for example. What are you doing with those people who will not conform to this new social order? The minorities that are from different religions, or Muslims or atheists or whatever. So I'm not sure whether mission mission changes people, so it will also change social orders, no doubt about that. But I'm wondering, is the purpose of mission really a changed society, a transformed society according to our ideals? I'm even doubting that, actually. I think it's much more a matter of establishing signs of the kingdom and witnesses to the kingdom probably often temporary, rather than building a new society or stuff like that. I think we should leave that to God.
That right there, I love that idea, because that, to me, one of the questions that comes up when we talk about these things is, okay, well then what should we measure? Right. So you've got, you know, how do we measure success or effectiveness or whatever? And it seems to me that at least that helps me relax, because the only measurement that I have is just remain faithful to this Jesus guy who's a pretty big deal. That at least is how I, at the end, when I've had my own crisis of thinking here in Sweden, I often refer to it as the beating of my head against the Swedish wall for a decade, before I finally realized maybe God hasn't called me to beat my head against this wall. Maybe he's just called me to be in the room. There's something freeing in that. But from your perspective, and I think this is what I was getting at a little bit with the idols comment. For me in this process, I worship results. So that was an idol I had. When that got stripped away in my own life, when I got called to the exile of quote unquote results, I began to see, I'm worshiping a God who gives me things for what I do for him, not for who he is. And so that's a little bit of what I mean. But what do you think of what should we be measuring if this is the case?
Or should we measure?
Or should we be measuring? So if we're called to bring signs of the kingdom, and some of them are temporary, if we're called to try to maybe get a little bit of growth in the Arctic tundra, not a tropical rainforest, what should we be measuring, or should we be measuring?
Thank you about the image, by the way. It's a very beautiful metaphor.
Yeah, I got it from you.
Yeah, I know. Okay, what should we? Well, I think this depends in the end on your view of salvation, your theology of salvation. What do you think God is out to do in the world? Mm-hmm. So, to cut a long story short, personally, I would say I think we do the most justice to the history to early Christianity, the New Testament, to the history of mission, if we would say that mission, or the building of God's kingdom, or whatever you call it, God's mission is, in the end, it's about community. I think reconciliation, I would say. When I envision the kingdom of God, the eschatological kingdom of God, I envision the multitudes together, a mass of people, a multitude of people from all nations and cultures and so on. Now, this is an eschatological ideal. I'm not saying that we will be building this, but if you build signs of the kingdom, or foretastes of the kingdom, or whatever you call it, then I think the question should always be, how does this serve real, deep community? Now, this sounds easy, but it is not. Because if you look at all the gaps and rifts within humanity, between human beings, think of issues like, how can victims and perpetrators ever live together in one community? What does this mean for forgiveness, for example? How can idealists and cynics ever live together? People from different races, former slaves and former slave traders, and so on. So men and women. So I think this focus on reconciled community, so to speak, as the kingdom of God, brings into focus all the questions that develop from the cross and from the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I think. Part of the problems that have plagued the Christian community in the 1970s and 80s is that the kingdom advocates, so to speak, and the conversion advocates drifted apart. So the one group was focused on sort of social ideals and changing society and building the kingdom, and the others on personal, individual conversion and getting into heaven after your death and so on. Now, I think on a deep level, these two belong together. And I think when we focus on the impossible, because it is impossible, the impossible ideal of reconciled community, then immediately all the questions pop up. How can this ever happen? without knowing that you're really deeply loved, that you're forgiven, that you need forgiveness, that you need to forgive others, that we need humility, kindness. Well, all the issues actually that the Apostle Paul writes about when he writes to his communities, to his churches. What does this mean for men-women relationships? What does it mean for sexuality? So all these issues that sort of drive people apart from each other. I think so. So when church planters, or whatever you call yourself, a missionary pioneer, or just a missionary, or a pastor, I think should focus on is what does it mean in my particular context, with the particular questions that pop up here and the histories that are behind us here. What does it mean to build community here? What kind of questions in terms of reconciliation, forgiveness, love? What kind of practices do we need to develop? A good friend of mine, who was a church planter, basically the first year in his church planting career, he did not much else than washing people's feet. Awkward sometimes, but he said, well, if it's not good for the people, it's good for me. Learned humility, he said, which is an important thing for him to learn. Now, it also produced all sorts of interesting conversations, but that's a different story. So the practices that you find in the New Testament, the meals, the communion meals, the washing of each other's feet, and so all these issues, I think, come into focus when we think what keeps this together. Well, that's the reconciled humanity. So that for me, that would be probably the egg that I would put in the basket when it comes to theology and salvation. So if you ask me, can you measure this? Yeah, well, to an extent, at least you can find things that you can worship God for. You can find things that you can thank God for. I would say things that feed, that foster your gratitude, your sense of gratitude of being involved in such a plan, something like that. And also, I think, but that's a thought I'm just developing and still thinking about. It might also be that in a post-Christian society that is increasingly plagued by all sorts of polarization, this is also something that is sort of resonates with the desire of the nations. I'm not saying that this will be, let's say, the silver bullet that will flock people into the church again. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, I think you'll find a lot of people outside the church who may never become Christians, but they can see the sense in a project like this. But yeah, this is worthwhile to invest your life in. I'm not sure that I will do it myself, but I'm glad that these crazy Christians do it.
Yeah.
Like that.
Which today in Western cultures we don't have. More often than not, I'm looked at as though I believe the world is flat, and there's no need for what I believe, because that would put me in a...
Yeah. We're the guys who invite you to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. Well, that's really not a very attractive message. I'm not saying that the gospel is all about being attractive, but yes, I would very much affirm that's the old Christmas gospel, so to speak, that the gospel does resonate with the desire of the nations.
Yeah.
If I'm very suspicious against some sort of, let's say, deeply conservative Christianity that says, as soon as people like what you say, then it must be wrong. That's not possible. We're creatures, all of us, and it's impossible that people will never like what Christians say, so to speak.
Yeah.
So in 1 Timothy, Paul lays out his qualifications for an elder. None of them would show up in a business leadership handbook. They're all familial. They're all character. Community building. Exactly right. So Paul also doesn't lay out, they need to be able to cast vision. They need to be able to strategize, plan. Maybe the deacons should do that. They're probably a little bit better at that administration bit. But So that kind of, it's something I've been pondering lately. This is still very raw, but I got a text from a friend who said, "Hey, look at this passage." And I was like, he said, "What do you see?" And I was like, "I don't, this." And he said, it's not leadership oriented, it's familial and community oriented. Oh. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And that's something I've been processing through. I have a degree in leadership, Christian leadership, which I think is, anyway, we won't go into my own cynicism on my own degree. Glad to have it, but be that as it may. So what role, sorry, this is I have a long runway to my questions here, Stefan.
That's good.
Yeah. So one of the, anyway. Yeah, there you go.
Guess what you're going.
What role does strategy and planning need to play in everything that we do? When you go to a church conference or when you go to a big evangelical meeting, so many breakout sessions are how to get more out of it, how to think strategically. When I look at people's strength finders, when we do strategic planning as an organization, I don't think that they're bad in and of themselves, but we put a lot of time and energy into those things. If what we're saying is we're looking for markers that can't necessarily be measured or shouldn't necessarily be measured, what do we spend our time doing? And is it a fool's errand to spend on the strategy thing?
Well, I don't want to make any cheap shots against all sort of leadership theories and so on.
I'll do it later in the podcast. Don't worry.
I even teach some leadership courses, and with some restrictions, I can see there's certain usefulness in that. I mean, I don't think it's ever recommended in Scripture or wherever Christians with some responsibility in the church should just do what they think and not listen to reason, or do not employ any wisdom, so to speak. So I always see leadership theories, or whatever sort of theories Christians use, for example, in rhetoric and preaching, or psychology and in pastoral care, and leadership theories in managing or leading the church. They're sort of, in German they would say Hilfswissenschaften, so the ancillary disciplines, so to speak. I'm always thinking of Larry Norman here. Why should the devil have all good music? So why should Christians not use this stuff? And I tend to think of it in lines with Old Testament wisdom, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and so on. There's sort of general wisdom that we can use. So to that extent, all fair and square. When it comes to but of course, there is a risk when all this theory sort of becomes a sort of silent takeover of what's really happening in church. So when you think of the books you just mentioned, cited Titus and 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy about offices, leadership in church. In a way, of course, they are not asked to cast vision, because they knew already what a vision was. Like I said, they had to embody that in themselves, the reconciled community. Paul was very clear about that. So the selection criteria, so to speak, were based on that kind of, I wouldn't call it a vision, they were kingdom-based. So in a sense, the risk with words like vision casting and so on is that we do it, and that we sort of think of our own vision. That's not true in church. So when I think of leadership in church, I always tend to think of when our children were young, we sometimes needed a babysit when my wife and I would go out to a restaurant or whatever. Now, I would say leadership in church is like being a babysitter of the church. The parents have not really left, but they have taken some distance. Now, a babysit, I think, would be quite wrong when he or she would say, well, I'll cast a completely different vision for this family because I thought of something. No, of course not. You're just trying to do as faithful as possible what the parents have asked you to do. So it's something like that. So it helps me to think in my own role as a leader in church of that also is quite relaxing in a sense. I don't have to think of the vision. What I'm looking for and what I'm trying to build is signs of community, signs of reconciled community. And that, of course, that gives you enough to keep you occupied for a lifetime. I mean, this is the human question, basically. So it's not just a churchy thing. Again, like I said, it's also very easy to communicate to non-Christians. What am I doing? I'm trying to build community, but I can tell you, community building is much more difficult than you think. That's why I need God, basically. And that's why Jesus died somehow. Anyway, so what's leadership in these books? Well, it's probably modeling this kind of stuff in your family or in your own life, being able to ask for forgiveness if you wrong someone, or being humble, stuff like that. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's not easy to do.
Yeah.
Like I said, it keeps you occupied for a lifetime, but it's easy to write down.
Yeah, Philippians 2 was really easy to write down.
Yeah,
less so to live out.
You can sing it and write it down. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Well, that's where from at least I come from a Pietist tradition. So a tradition that's very vertical. Jesus should come in your heart. It's no use that Christ was born in Bethlehem. He should be born in your heart and stuff like that. So a very subjective, deep sense of sin and of conversion. And this is the way I became a Christian. The kingdom message I discovered later in my life. And I've struggled with that a lot, how to keep that together, because deep inside I sensed, and also theologically, I sensed that you can't just throw it away. You can say pietism was all wrong. So to some extent, I think focusing on this kingdom ideal of reconciled community brings up again and again questions like conversion, for example, confession of sin, being completely, utterly dependent on Christ and his cross. But not as a sort of doctrinal idea, which is very hard to explain in societies like ours. Why should I believe in Christ? Why should I believe that he saved us on the cross? He saved us from what? I don't need salvation. Unless you'll find that you are embarked on a project, if that's the word, on a mission of building reconciled community, then you'll find out that you'll need all this stuff. Something like that. I mean, at least that's what I try to teach in my community, my church, and to embody. Yeah.
One of speaking of reconciled communities, one of the obviously we're all here because we're passionate to some degree about reaching Europeans, knowing Jesus, and so, but we're also living in this time period of the global church where we have, it's quite a incredible time to be alive in some sense, because you have the churches really everywhere in most places in the world, and it's going all over the place, and for the good side of that, the bad side of that, the complex side of that. And so, we have a tension in Spain where we have a lot of immigration. We have a lot of particularly South American immigration and missionaries coming now, which on one hand is very exciting, but on the other hand creates a bit of a stress in the sense that Spaniards sometimes will see the gospel as foreign or external, or the church is something. Although that's beginning to change, we're starting to see second and third generation people who've grown up. So I'm interested in the idea of that reconciling community. And do you think there's something that maybe even God's doing or could be doing in that, maybe that could call more Europeans to the church? Or it's something I'm still, fighting with and struggling with. But difficult for me to answer the question for your context. But I think this is one of the first tasks for a church planter or a missionary, to find out, to think through, to reflect on, to pray through these kind of questions in his or her context. What does it mean to heal humanity, to reconcile people in my context? So I can, when I speak about my context in Amsterdam, for example, part of the issue is, for example, left-wing and right-wing people. Even within the church, but also in society at large. You'll find deep rifts between people who are more right-wing, nationalistically oriented, and people who are progressives. And they not just
they do not just take a distance from each other, they positively hate each other. It's not just in Europe, I think it's in the United States, as far as I can get the same story.
Seems to be the case.
Seems to be the case.
Seems to be the case. We get some of this wins. Anyway, so I think this is a huge challenge in societies like ours. How can people differ or even being passionately different in terms of politics and still love each other? How can I be dedicated to, for example, a righteous society, climate change policy and all that, and still love my brothers or even non-brothers, I mean, non-Christian, who are deeply opposed to that and who spread fake news, in my opinion, and so on. So how to, so from let's say from an idealistic or progressive perspective, you could say, how can you be sort of idealist and progressive without looking down on those who are not? Without losing your love, because I think that's the first and last task for every Christian, to love your neighbor and even your enemies. Now, this is a lifetime task already, but I think still something that resonates with larger parts and segments of our societies, even if people are not Christians. In one way or another, we can't go on like this forever. I'm always thinking of the book of Jonah here. Jonah was a righteous prophet who fought for a righteous cause. I mean, Nineveh was really a very bad city, a very bad place. Yeah. Their iniquities had risen up to God. That's what the first verse says. So Jonah was in it. I mean, he was the member of a righteous people going to a very unrighteous place but the problem is he was too glad to do it. So how can you identify with a righteous cause without hating those who are opposite, who are your opponents? So these are very deep questions. We can't solve them in just a few minutes here, but I'm just pointing them out. I think there is something in this for everyone. That's my point, I think. Not just for the bad people, but also maybe especially so for the good people.
Yeah.
There is a theologian, Korean-American theologian, Andrew Sung Park, who wrote a book called Triune Atonement, in which he I'm not sure that I fully agree with everything in it, but one of the things he takes is the Korean concept of something called Han, which is this idea that it's basically sin, but it's basically the rift that comes in between people of both the oppressor and the oppressed, or the sinner and the sinned. It basically is the sense of loss that someone feels when something is stolen from them, but then the burden that person who stole it carries. And what he proposes is that the atonement of Christ pays for the Han, that it takes both aspects of that on it, not just it takes the person who's been sinned against and it takes their hurt, but it also takes the responsibility of the person. And so seeing the cross in that way is something that can step into that fray. It's something that speaks to both the conservative and the progressive, the left and the right. It's something, but if you're holding on to that progressive or conservative side too tightly, you lose the aspect of the cross, because then the cross becomes something with which to, wield against others rather than speak directly to you.
Yes, true. So how to keep together the cross and the kingdom, basically. Yeah. That's the question here. Now, and so my point would be to return to our first question, Sir Barrett and Garrick. I think focusing on these kind of issues will also help us to think missionally, or to become missionaries again. Because one of the problems for many, let's say, evangelicals or more traditional Protestants in mission in secular countries is that they are bothered. They occupy their minds constantly with questions like, how can I get people to believe in things that they do not really find believable at all? So then you are deeply into apologetics and trying to convince people and so on. But in the end, you try to convince them of things that do not really seem to play a part in their daily lives or in their societies. Yep. Mission, and that's what I learned from my African friends, is deeply involved with the questions of society and the sufferings of people and the joys of people. So what we're discussing here in this brief podcast now, and then it's far too short, and we should do this more often. But my point is, I think what we try to do here is to think through the questions of cross and kingdom, cross and resurrection and kingdom, in connection with the deep questions of society, Western society, which I think nowadays revolve around these deep issues of polarization that is increasingly a problem driving us apart, and which is really something that concerns a lot of people. And so I'm not saying that the gospel, that would be the wrong things to say. I'm not saying that the gospel is basically sort of answer to questions we have, sort of you can plug them into the holes that we have. That's not the point. It's more of a dialectic relationship. Of course, the gospel has much more to say than just this, but for now, in our context, the most contextual message could be this. Whereas, for example, in the age of revivals, when people became individuals and democratized and so on, different aspects of the gospel became highlighted. For now, it might be the reconciliatory dimensions of the gospel, I would say, come to the forefront.
Yeah, I think it's something you explain well, is that, and I'm seeing clear here, is the idea that missions is an art, because it's local, it's contextual, it's not, it doesn't have to be the same thing throughout 2,000 years of history, and it can't be, and it simply hasn't. There's certain core values, which we can find in the New Testament in Jesus that we don't abandon, but in a sense it is and it requires maybe more artists, people with that kind of creativity than it would, say, a typical by the book, which evangelicalism has always tended to be very. Not always, but we tend to be very by the book kind of. Here's the method. Here's the way.
Yeah, evangelicalism. Evangelicals usually do not like to hear that. It's actually quite a modern Christian movement.
Yeah,
it originated in the 1780s, so to speak. So it's not that old. And evangelicals like to think that Adam and Eve already were evangelicals, but it's not like that. So it's a movement very much rooted in early democratic. Societies, individualization, emancipation of minorities, and so on. So there is a sort of empowerment of the individual. If you read through the books of Babington, for example, about the early revivals, you can see a lot of assurance and so on. So that was, I think, that was the gospel for these societies, very much so. In every context, Christians, missionaries need to ask this question: what does it mean to witness about the gospel in my context? Well, I think they did a good job then, but we're in a very different context now, a context where societies are drifting apart and polarizing. So their coherence.
A lot of what we've talked about has been kind of this idea of exile or pilgrim that comes forth in your book, but there's also the aspect of becoming priests. And these two ideas have been incredibly helpful for me. Both Garrick and I have a dear affection for the Camino de Santiago. So the idea of pilgrimage and walking with people and doing things with them, I think, is an incredible idea for how we do mission. And not for you, but for those who are listening, I want to draw the distinction between mission and evangelism here, because oftentimes evangelism becomes a means to an end rather than mission is just what we're caught up in doing along the way that we go. But can you speak a little bit to the idea of how are we, out of Peter, called to be priests in the world that we live in, and how do you think that is helpful for the cultural moment that we're in?
Yeah, that's a big question. Let me try. So the book is called Pilgrims and Priests. So we basically talked about the first part, pilgrims, let's say becoming exiles, losing power, losing control of culture, or others are calling the shots and so on. And the pilgrim part, of the priest part, is basically saying, but this should not encourage us to withdraw from society, to turn our backs to society, or to become Christians who are presenting themselves out of a sort of resentment to society, culture war kind of stuff. So the priest part is basically saying, how can you still serve society, be missionaries? Now, the priest metaphor has become very dear to me. when I look through all the scriptural passages about exile and diaspora, and also in the New Testament, and especially when you look in the first letter of Peter, when he talks about the Christian churches in diaspora as priestly communities. You're a kingdom of priests, he says, or a royal priesthood. Different translations of essentially the same thing. Now, thinking through the identity of the Christian community as being a priesthood helps me to think through the missionary relationship of the church with society. So what priests, what did they do in the Bible, or probably in any culture, but at least in the Old Testament? Well, you can see they sort of mediate between God and people, God in their context, God in the neighborhood, the village, the city, the country. How do they mediate? Well, they represent God to the people. How do they do that? By teaching. The priests in the Bible instruct, they teach the Torah. And by blessing people. They bless, that's what they do. They bless and teach. And they represent the people to God. They are chosen out of the people as a minority, by definition. That's one of the interesting elements of being a priesthood. You're a minority by definition. But they represent the people, the neighborhood, the world, the country, and so on, to God. And what do priests do? Again, two things when they represent the people to God. They sacrifice. So the best of their culture, they bring to God. We can think through what it means today in terms of art or effort, whatever. And they worship. They glorify God. So I think these four elements of, on the one hand, teaching and blessing, on the other hand, worshiping and sacrificing, help me to think through the whole spectrum, so to speak, of what it means to be a missional community in the West today. And without going into detail, I'd say for any community that would help, how can we be the priesthood of our neighborhood? Well, basically, it means to have, to also develop a sort of identity that you can praise God and sacrifice God on behalf of the community. That also gets us away from a church growth driven model in which each and everyone is sort of individual, needs to be individually before God in order to worship him, God. Because what you can see in the Bible, and I think this is something we need to learn as Westerners, is again this communal vision, much more than we have developed it. When we, for example, let me just an example. Think of the book of Job. Job chapter 1, where Job is pictured as a righteous man. And one of the reasons why he is righteous is that he, every evening, he offers sacrifice on behalf of all his children. Because, he says, they may have sinned without knowing. So let me sacrifice it. And it's very interesting. But you could say that's Old Testament, that's Semitic culture and so on. We're different. Well, in the New Testament, you find the same thing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, when the Corinthians write to the Apostle Paul about marriage, one of the questions they ask Paul is, what if a Christian is married to a non-Christian? Should they divorce? Should they separate? And then Paul says no, because the non-Christian partner is sanctified in the Christian partner, and also your children are holy. Now, I think this makes very little sense from an individualistic paradigm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's one of the reasons why many Protestants cannot make sense of this text. But what I think what Paul says there is, to some extent, I mean, without going into all the depths of the mysteries of salvation, but in a very simple level, on a very basic level, I think that's encouraging for every missionary, or for every Christian even, if you're the only one in your street or the only one in your family. Through you, God sort of blesses the community you're part of, those people you are linked to in love and all sorts of ties you have in friendship. Now, coming back to the priesthood, I'd say priests are people who build friendships, who build relationships. And through these relationships and through the friendship, they may believe, they are allowed to believe, the scripture tells them so, that all their friends and family members and the people in the street are blessed through them. So this, in a way, also means that every conversation you have, every act of service, every way of connecting with people is, even if people don't become Christians, and usually they don't, is still a channel of salvation, so to speak. Now, you need to work this out in more detail and so on. In the book, there is more about this, but I'm just sketching the main picture here.
Right.
So I think to be a priesthood is to believe, to be utterly convinced, and I think we can be on the basis of Scripture, that being a minority, that this particular minority has an impact that is much, much, much bigger than it ever dares to believe. If we take seriously that the gospel, that the Bible thinks in communities, in relationships. This is something we can also learn from the non-Western church, by the way. But it's a different story.
Yeah.
Which is very much a Western problem, a Western Protestant problem, I might add.
Yeah. Interestingly, Bono sings in a song by U2, blessings not just for the ones who kneel. Luckily, that's what he's, so that this idea that there is what is done in the name of Jesus has a much bigger, much more universal impact.
Absolutely.
And I think you're right. This is another thing for me in the book that was very powerful, was because you read that the First Peter chapter about royal priesthood, but I think we always, especially as an American, we tend to truncate that into that. Well, that means I have access to Jesus, and that's kind of, it becomes a very personalized, very one-on-one, which is part of that conversation. But we miss the wider scope of what being a priest really is, which is,
again, I mean, the way Luther, for example, interpreted this particular notion of the priesthood was indeed to have access to God, unmediated access, without bishops, popes, and so on, which I think made a lot of sense in its context. Probably it was a very contextual gospel. But again, in our atomized societies, when individualism has become rampant, I think we need different accents. And Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, has become part of this modern individualistic culture in a much deeper way than we care to believe. And here, I think the gospel also cuts in our own flesh, because it's hard to make sense of texts that Paul so offhandedly writes. The children are holy as well. Because one of the parents is a Christian. How can that be? Yeah, apparently it can be.
I shouldn't say that everyone should be a missionary or live in the Middle East or in Central Asia or North Africa, but it was helpful in that regard when I lived there to read the Bible with new lenses, because everything was but there was so much more familial aspect. So I'll never forget my friend who had just been disowned by his father for becoming a believer when he was reading, I have more family. And he thought, I know who my family is now. And he went to the church and, and so that means something, but to an atomized Western individualist, it's hard to grasp because you don't see it with those lenses. And so having those dissonant voices are helpful.
Yeah, and probably this wouldn't be a message I would proclaim in, let's say, South Korea, which probably is much too collective for my taste, at least. So it's a very contextualized message for Western society. I want to repeat that, to reiterate that. But the role of the church in our Western post-Christian societies, I think, is being a minority. At least for the foreseeable future, I don't see much change in that. Probably will become even smaller. But I would say the priesthood minority that, on the one hand, believes that God is involved in secularization of our cultures. He has not abandoned us. And a community that, despite its size, has much more impact than it cares to believe, if only it would abandon its individualistic mindset. And then also a community that hopefully builds signs of reconciled humanity, or that contributes to reconciled neighborhoods and all that, and within this context also testifies to Christ whenever the opportunity presents itself. Because in this post-Christian society, there's of course lots of intuitions, free-floating beliefs, and so on are going on that are still very familiar, very related to the gospel. So maybe the church in the future will also be something of the collective memory of the storehouse of memory of Western societies. Could be.
As Peter Hitchens used to remark about his brother Christopher Hitchens, he forgets whose shoulders he stands on. There's truth to that. All this is reminding me. I want to ask about your thoughts on COVID and the situation as far as the church's, the role that we have to play. There seems to be, I'm not sure I'm going to do it, but I'll set us up for another podcast. There seems to be a sense from a lot of people that, okay, this is the revival moment we've been waiting for. A lot of hope in that. And it seems to me that we're going back to the same horses and chariots, that we're putting our trust in. I have nothing against revival in and of itself. I want revival. I want to see that. But where I'm going with this is I was recently reading the Last Battle, C.S. Lewis's last book of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe to My Children. And that book does not end the way I, as an American, want it to end, in the sense of, in this life, I want to see the last battle. Aslan comes in, he destroys everybody. Then he goes, okay, guys, now we go into my kingdom. And it actually ends with the king and everyone else saying, well, if we die, Aslan's still faithful. And it seems to me that's everything I need to know as a missionary. I may be standing with my back against the rocks. I may be watching everything come crashing down. There's just the remnant. I watch my friends pass. But in the end, I'm with Aslan. I'm there, and he remains faithful, and he remains good. And that seems to be and so anyway, so I won't have you go into the COVID things, but yeah, not in our world, right?
It's not our world.
Yeah.
It's his world.
And so, but we have something we see through a mirror yet dimly, right. And that's what we're looking for. So I love that idea that you've talked about today of foretastes that we have, that we're the proclaimers of foretastes of the kingdom to come, that we look forward to that, and that we hold out for his faithful reappearance and his faithful ushering in of his final kingdom. So we've kept you way too long, but we are. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We would love to. I'd love it if we could do it again sometime, and we'll delve deeper into some of these things. But we just thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this will be a real blessing for a lot of
ministry.
people.
Thank you.
With this podcast, obviously.
Yeah. Everybody out there in the interwebs, go out, do yourself a favor. If you are in ministry or you are a believer in Jesus, go and get Pilgrims and Priests by Stefan Paas.
Yeah,
it is the best.
And church planning in the secular West, learning from the European experience, also an excellent book.
Both equally good books. But anyway, do yourself a favor, go get that and read it and be changed and follow Jesus. Guys, I'm going to go do my Swedish afternoon coffee thing, but it was a pleasure to get to talk to both of you.
Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan.